What's up, adventurers? My name is Platinum Phoenix, and welcome back to Fossil Fighters. This video is a compilation of sorts. So basically what it is it's just every single bio that I did for my Fossil Fighters playthrough. If you are watching this video, it's basically for one of three reasons. The first is that you are getting ready to play the game and you just want to hear my thoughts on all of the Vivosaurs. The second is that you are incredibly bored and just wanted like an hour or so long video to listen to. And the third would be that you are working on something and just need a ton of background noise while you're doing stuff. And this video will accomplish all of those things. So if you are one of those three reasons, you're in the right place. But with that being said, if you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And with that being said, let's get to the bios. Spinax is the very first Vivosaur given at the beginning of each playthrough. It being an all-around class means that it has beneficial traits in each position on the battlefield. From having an auto counter and high attack that makes it really good in the attack zone, to it having good support buffs and defense increasing abilities later on in the game that makes it really good in the support zone. One thing to mention is that the stats in these bios are when the Vivosaurs are at max rank. So these are the stats that you will have if kept throughout the entire game. The only real downside to Spinax is that it is an air-type Vivosaur. That's the main type of Vivosaur we will be encountering for the next several areas will be mostly air-type Vivosaurs. But I highly recommend using it for at least the foreseeable future, since it is so versatile and useful in every spot on the battlefield. Shanshan is the only Vivosaur found in the practice dig site. Shanshan's main thing is that it has a higher than normal critical hit chance, so it makes it a good choice to put in the attack position. The downside to that is that Shanshan has low life points, so putting it out front is a double-edged sword, since it can't really take many head-on attacks. It also has good support effects, increasing each stat of the attack zone Vivosaur by 5%, so simply having it around to buff your main attacker could be a decent strategy. Overall, I think Shanshan works well for the beginning game, but eventually gets overshadowed by Vivosaurs found later. Goyle, our first defensive class Vivosaur. Defensive class Vivosaurs are classified by having a significantly higher defense stat, evasion stat, or life points than other Vivosaurs. For Goyle, this means having a higher defense stat than any other Vivosaur you could possibly find at this point in the game. This makes it a really good support zone Vivosaur to allow its allies to get an attack and accuracy buff, while also being able to switch into the attack zone to take some hits while you build up your FP. Overall, a pretty good choice if you want a more tanky Vivosaur, but gets outclassed by other defensive Vivosaurs farther in the game. And the only other Vivosaur that can be found here is the V-Raptor. The V-Raptor is our first example of an attack class Vivosaur. The attack class is classified by being able to deal a lot of damage very quickly, but not having a lot of life points or defense. In the case of the V-Raptor, it also uses a lot of poison skills to help inflict even more damage. It may just be another air-type Vivosaur found here, but I would make sure to pick it up if you want a Vivosaur that can really quickly end battles in the early game. We are finally out of the realm of air-types with Nychus, our first fire-type Vivosaur. Similar to V-Raptor, Nychus deals in poison attacks to cause extra damage to the opponent. Nychus is also our first example of a Vivosaur having negative support effects that affect the opponent. This means that unlike the V-Raptor, Nychus is much better at sitting in the support zone and firing off poison attacks while debuffing the enemy, instead of being an all-out attacker. Overall, this Vivosaur is for the people who want to restrict how much damage their opponent can do, while also causing them reliable and consistent damage. The next Vivosaur found in the Knotwood Forest is the S-Raptor. The S-Raptor has nothing really unique about it. As its description says, it is a solid and versatile Vivosaur. This means that while the S-Raptor doesn't have any special strengths that the other Vivosaurs we've seen have, it also doesn't have any large downsides that the others may have. It has a decent support effect to help your side, and also gets a move that can force the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur to be knocked into the escape zone, which is good if you're facing a Vivosaur that you want to face later after you defeat the support Vivosaurs. This is a safe option if you just need an extra Vivosaur to round out your team, or if you want a Vivosaur that is good in any position. Finally, the last Vivosaur that appears here is the Venator. Venator is our first Earth-type Vivosaur. It is an all-around class Vivosaur that eventually gets the ability to stop the opponent from switching their Vivosaurs into other zones. This is extremely useful if you are able to inflict statuses on the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur, since it won't be able to go to the escape zone to remove those statuses. Venator also gets the ability to raise evasion of other Vivosaurs, which stacks with its support skills, also raising the evasion of Vivosaurs in your attack zone. I would say that is less useful in the beginning of the game, only really being able to do direct damage at first, but becomes much more useful once you are able to get more Venator bones to power it up. The first Vivosaur that can be found in the Dig-A-Dig-A-Mid is Lexo. This is the first Vivosaur that you are able to find that you could have told Captain Travers is your favorite. This is important because Captain Travers gives you the legs of the Vivosaur, and that is a massive bonus to Lexo since it gives you access to 3 of its abilities right from the start. This, plus the fact that Lexo uses several sleep and poison abilities, makes it a really strong option. Overall, I would say Lexo is a good option for anyone who wants a Vivosaur that excels at controlling the tempo of battle. The only other Vivosaur found in the Dig-A-Dig-A-Mid is Pachy. Pachy is our first example of a long-range class. Long-range Vivosaurs are classified by their abilities to deal full power damage from the support zone. This means that no matter where the Vivosaur is, it will never have a damage reduction when attacking. Speaking about Pachy specifically, it has several low FP cost abilities, which means that there are several times that you would be able to find a chance to use one of Pachy's abilities, even if you've already attacked with another Vivosaur before. Low FP cost abilities, plus the ability to lower the opponent's defense with its support skills, makes Pachy a reliable and a consistent member of any team that it's on. Before we go over the next group of Vivosaurs we have access to, we need to talk about how to obtain them. These Vivosaurs are bought with donation points. If you talk to the woman that is behind the podium in the cleaning room, you can purchase fossil rocks from her. We technically gained this ability to buy these Vivosaurs at the beginning of Chapter 2, but this is the time that most players would have enough saved donation points to purchase any of them. There are 2 major things that donation point Vivosaurs have that are different from other Vivosaurs. The first is that all bone types are available to buy right from the beginning. This means that if you have enough donation points, you can fully upgrade any of the Vivosaurs that you can buy. The other is that all fossil rocks purchased are rare fossil rocks. This just means that the bones are red and you gain an extra 25 points that are added to the final total of any successfully cleaned fossil. Both of these things together makes donation point Vivosaurs extremely valuable and worth getting. With all that being said, the first Vivosaur that can be bought for 50 donation points per bone is Stego. Stego is an all-around class Vivosaur that has a massive amount of life points. This makes it slightly more usable than it would be otherwise, since other than its life points, the Stego does not really have anything else really going for it. I would recommend skipping on getting this and saving your donation points for something else that is actually more useful. But other than that, Stego is also Dr. Diggin's favorite Vivosaur, and I think that's pretty cool. The next Vivosaur you can buy is the F-Raptor. Each of the F-Raptor's bones costs 75 donation points in order to buy, and with the same attack stat as Spinax, the F-Raptor is really good at being a front and center fighter, while also having really nice support skills if it needs to sit in the back for a while. Overall, F-Raptor is a powerful addition to any team that is looking for a good Earth-type Vivosaur. The third Vivosaur that you can purchase with donation points is Ptera. The first thing is that Ptera has an upfront cost of 100 donation points per fossil to buy. Ptera also has a higher than average critical hit chance, while also being a long-range class Vivosaur. This means that Ptera can launch full-powered attacks from the support zone, with the chance to also have critical hits happen more often. On top of that, Ptera also has a support effect that lowers the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur's evasion by 40%. This means that Ptera can attack full power from anywhere on the field, has a higher chance of critting, and also makes it harder for your opponents to dodge your attacks. All of that with the fact that it is a donation point Vivosaur, meaning that you can buy as many bones as you want, makes Ptera an amazing team member that specializes in dealing great damage from a distance. And finally, the last Vivosaur you can purchase is Compso. Compso is the most expensive donation point Vivosaur, costing 200 donation points per fossil to buy. Compso is a golden example that a Vivosaur only having one thing it excels in, while everything else is either middling or straight up bad, can still make a great team member if used correctly. Compso has little attack power, laughable defense, and even less life points to back that up. This means that if Compso gets hit in the attack zone, it will die. On top of that, all of Compso's abilities are strictly damage based, meaning that there are no statuses or anything else that Compso will be inflicting. But none of that even matters as soon as you look at its support effects. Compso can cause the attack zone Vivosaur of your opponents to have its attack and defense cut by 90%. This all but leaves the opponent helpless, since removing 90% of any stat would basically leave a Vivosaur with single-digit numbered stats. All of this is to say, having a Compso just sit back and nerf your opponent is a really good strategy if you are okay with only bringing 2 Vivosaurs that will actually be doing any damage. The first Vivosaur that can be found in the main area of the Rivet Ravine is Alectro. With Alectro, we finally have access to our first Water-type Vivosaur. Alectro is classified as an all-out attacking class Vivosaur, and its skills can inflict either Scare or Poison on the opponent, which helps Alectro control the options that opponent is able to do. This Vivosaur is for the people who like the idea of controlling the battlefield, but unlike the other Vivosaurs we've seen, they would rather it be an attack type rather than like a support or defensive type Vivosaur. After Alectro is Coatlus. Coatlus is a long-range air-type Vivosaur that eventually gets the ability to both enrange the opponent's Vivosaur, as well as push the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur into the escape zone. But other than that, I would say that Coatlus is basically just a diet version of Ptera. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the only real reason you would want to use Coatlus is that you like the idea of using Ptera, but don't want to spend the donation points in order to get it. Next up is our first example of a neutral-type Vivosaur in Megalo. Megalo, similar to Alectro, specializes in controlling the opponent's Vivosaurs by inflicting them with Excite and Scare statuses. Megalo also is our first instance of an ability that can equalize both yours and your opponent's total FP. This is useful because each knocked out Vivosaur rewards the owner of that Vivosaur with a large amount of FP, so by using this skill, Megalo can steal a lot of that FP and allow you to potentially attack with another Vivosaur in the same turn. Overall, I would say that Megalo is useful if you want a Vivosaur that is not weak to any type, since it's a neutral type Vivosaur, and are planning to keep it until the late game to get that FP equalizing skill. The first new Vivosaur that can be found in the main tunnels is Elasmoth. Elasmoth is a support class with the ability to raise the defense and accuracy stat of your attack zone Vivosaur. It also eventually gets the ability to knock the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur into the escape zone, as well as inflict the Scare status onto the opponent's Vivosaurs. Elasmoth is also the first time that we have seen a Vivosaur with the Parting Blow ability. This ability is activated when a Vivosaur goes below a certain amount of its maximum life points, and in the case of Elasmoth, that is at or below 10% of its max life points. But this brings up the question, if it has to be at such a low life for it to activate, what does it do? Well, Parting Blow raises the attack and accuracy stats of the Vivosaur by a set amount depending on the Vivosaur. It also raises the defense and speed stats by half of the amount that the attack and accuracy stats rose. For Elasmoth specifically, the increase to the attack and accuracy stats are 200%, which means that these stats are effectively tripled, while the defense and speed stats go up to 100% increase, doubling the effective stat. This all means that Elasmoth is a really good Desperation Vivosaur. So I would recommend Elasmoth to players who like all the base things that I said about Elasmoth, like the support effects that it has, or the ability to inflict scare status or knock the opponent's Vivosaur into the escape zone. But I'd also like the idea of having a Vivosaur that can go nuclear if desperate. But after Elasmoth is Stygi. Stygi is a long-range Vivosaur that deals specifically in damage-dealing abilities. All of Stygi's abilities are also dirt cheap, ranging from 30 FP on the low end, all the way up to 90 FP at the top. The best comparison I could give is that Stygi is a fire-type Pachy, while also having cheaper skills. So if you like the idea of using Pachy, but don't like the idea of it being an Earth-type Vivosaur, Stygi might be the Vivosaur for you. The next Vivosaur found in the tunnels is Nasaur. Nasaur is a Water-type Vivosaur as well as a Support class Vivosaur, and it definitely embodies what it means to be a Support class. Nasaur, while in the Support zone, has the effect of reducing all of the stats of the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur by 15%. Nasaur also comes equipped with several poison skills to help with its lower attack stat, and Nasaur is also the first Vivosaur that we have seen that has the ability to heal your other Vivosaurs. Nasaur gets the skill called Life Charge, which costs 100 FP, but in exchange gives up to 80 life points to the target Vivosaur. This is amazing because many hard battles later in the game come down to sometimes single-digit life amounts, so this skill could save you in a battle when you least expect it. Overall, I would say use Nasaur if you like the idea of having the ability to nerf your opponents, while eventually being able to help your own Vivosaurs as well. Lastly, only found rarely in tunnel number 4 is Giganto. Giganto has several things that makes it a really good Vivosaur. The first is that massive attack stat, which means that if Giganto hits anything for at least neutral damage, it will cause a nice chunk of life points to be taken. Giganto also gets an ability called Law of the Jungle, which allows it to heal itself by taking life points from your other Vivosaurs. This could be helpful in situations where you have some support Vivosaurs, but you really need your attack zone Vivosaur to survive a couple more turns in order to win the fight. On the other hand, there are a few downsides to Giganto. The first and biggest is that it is incredibly rare to find when looking for the fossils here in the tunnels. The second thing is that it has detrimental support effects for your own attack zone. So if you are using Giganto, make sure to keep it in the attack zone to avoid the debuffs. Overall, I would say if you want to use Giganto on your main story playthrough team, then this is the time to find it. But if you are just looking to revive it for completion, then there's a different place later on in the game that makes it much easier to find. The first Vivosaur found in tunnel number 5 is Ourano. Ourano is a perfect picture of perfectly average. It is an all-around class Vivosaur with middling support effects that causes the attack zone of your opponents to lose 7% from all of their stats. Ourano also has an ability that inflicts confusion on a target, which can be helpful by taking away any choices from your opponent. Overall, I would say that if you're still looking for an Earth-type Vivosaur to round out your team, then Ourano is a perfectly good option. The only other Vivosaur found in tunnel number 5 is the U-Raptor. The U-Raptor trades many of the poison abilities that other Velociraptor-style Vivosaurs have for pure power. U-Raptor, at its strongest, has at least 10 more points in its attack stat as well as 50 more base damage on its attacks than the other Velociraptors. This means that the U-Raptor works more like an attack class Vivosaur that is more comfortable switching zones frequently to allow it to live longer and deal as much damage as it can. Overall, I would recommend the U-Raptor to anyone that liked the idea of the other Velociraptor's hit and run style of fighting, but just wanted a little more power behind that style of fighting. The first of the Vivosaurs found in the underwater area is Elasmo. Elasmo is a long-range Vivosaur with a focus on causing your opponents to miss their attacks. It does this by having several skills that inflict enrage on the opponent. The downside to Elasmo is that it has a lower than average chance to land a critical hit, as well as not having any support effects to speak of. Overall, I would say that Elasmo is a reliable Vivosaur that will allow all of your other Vivosaurs to live longer by spreading the enraged status to your opponents. Next up is Plesio. Plesio is basically just a Diet Elasmo. It is weaker in both overall stats and in damage per skill, but it makes up for it by having a very high critical hit chance at 40%, as well as having very nice support effects. The only other real difference between Plesio and Elasmo is that Plesio trades out the enraged skills that Elasmo has for poison skills instead. Overall, Plesio is for the players who like Elasmo, but wanted a more support-oriented version. After Plesio is Krona. Called the T-Rex of the Sea, it boasts a massive 85-point attack stat, which makes Krona one of the most powerful purely attacking Vivosaurs out there. Being long-range class also allows it to sit pretty much anywhere on the battlefield and launch its powerful attacks at their full strength. There is one giant downside to Krona, however. Its support effects lower your own attack zone Vivosaurs by 20% in each stat. This means that if it's in the support zone, then you are negatively affecting your own team by a massive amount. With that being said, there are two ways that I would go about using a Vivosaur like Krona. The first is by having it act like an attack class rather than a long-range class. This means to just put it in the attack zone and let it fire off its powerful attacks, while your other Vivosaurs are either buffing it or nerfing your opponent. The second way is using Krona is to not really care about the Vivosaur you have in your attack zone. If you don't care about that Vivosaur, or if that Vivosaur has already done what it needed to do in the battle, then the negative support effects of Krona no longer matter, which means you can have it safely in the support zone while also firing its attacks from there. Overall, I would say that if you are looking for a Vivosaur that you have to think a little bit more about, or if you've played the game before and want a Vivosaur that's a little harder to use, then Krona is an excellent choice. Next up is Shoni. The description reads, while powerful, Shoni is hampered by very slow development. And for the life of me, I do not know what this description is talking about. Shoni is the counterpart to Krona, being a long-range class with negative support effects to your own attack zone. The main difference is that Shoni only drops the stats by 15%, but its attack stat is significantly lower than Krona's to balance that out. Overall, Shoni plays a very similar role to Krona, so I would recommend it to anyone that liked the idea of using Krona, but didn't want the downside to be as big. Or if you just like dolphins. And the final Vivosaur that can be found in the underwater portion of Bottoms Up Bay is Delta. Delta is a rare find here and is only found in Cavern number 3. Delta eventually gets both a Confuse skill as well as a Counter skill, but the main thing that Delta is useful for is its ability to increase the amount of FP you recharge each turn. Delta has a passive ability called FP+, which means that as long as Delta is on your team during a battle, you will recharge 20% more FP per turn than you would regularly. This effect only applies if Delta is on the battlefield, so keeping it alive could make battles that you find more difficult much easier since you gain the ability to do more on your turns. Overall, I would say that Delta is a really good Vivosaur, if for nothing else than its FP plus ability, but it is extremely difficult to find here. So if you want a Delta, it is in your best interest to just wait a little while since it becomes much easier to find in the near future. The first of the Vivosaurs found on the sunken ship is not a water type, but is the M-Raptor. The M-Raptor is very similar to the other Velociraptors as it has several poison skills that are also very cheap. The way the M-Raptor separates itself from the other Velociraptors by having some of the best support effects in the game. While in the support zone, the M-Raptor boosts each stat of your own attack zone Vivosaur by at least 15%. This could be the reason why your Vivosaur overcomes the opponent, and is also the main reason I would recommend the M-Raptor. If you are looking for a support style Vivosaur that can cause reliable damage thanks to that poison, then the M-Raptor could be the perfect fit for your team. The next Vivosaur found here is Onyx. Onyx is not a 29-foot tall rock snake, but is an attack class Vivosaur with a massive attack stat. Onyx also gets access to skills that inflict Excite and Poison onto your opponent's Vivosaur. The main downside to using Onyx is that it has an abysmal defense stat, which isn't great since it's going to be in the attack zone the most often. If you plan to use Onyx, make sure to plan out when you want to switch it in to deal a decisive blow to your opponent, because if you don't, Onyx is likely to be defeated within a few attacks. After Onyx is Jiango. Jiango is the only Stegosaurus-style Vivosaur that is an attack class. With higher than average attack stats and critical hit rates, it makes Jiango really suited to sit in the attack zone and throw out its mostly just damage dealing skills at the opponent. The only real downside is that its own support effects are mixed, with one stat being decreased by 10%, while two are raised by 5% each. I would say that if you like Stego or Lexo, but wanted more power out of them, then Jiango is exactly the Vivosaur that you are looking for. The second to last Vivosaur that can be found here is Futabi. Futabi is a long-range Vivosaur that excels in inflicting your opponents with the Excite status. It also has really nice support effects, so putting it into the support zone and launching attacks at long range is a good strategy with Futabi. Futabi is also one of the few Vivosaurs that get the ability to equalize FP using its skill Power Scale. On top of that, Futabi is also one of only 3 Vivosaurs that belong to the Japanese style of Vivosaur. The other 2 are the F-Raptor and Mihu. The reason that this is important is that when these 3 are put onto a team together, they unlock their special team attack. Overall, Futabi is an average, if not slightly above average Vivosaur that would fit well onto almost any team. And the final Vivosaur that is only found rarely on the Sunken Ship's first floor right room is Seismo. Seismo is an Earth-type Vivosaur that specializes in living a very long time while dealing a lot of damage. Seismo only gains access to damage-dealing skills, but does have a passive that allows it to recover a percentage of its life points at the beginning of each turn. This is amazing for 2 reasons. The first is that only 2 Vivosaurs get this ability in the entire game. The second is that Seismo has the higher life point total of the 2 by a large margin. This means that even though Seismo only heals 5% of its life points each turn, at rank 12, that means it still would be getting 35 life points that you get for free at the start of each turn. This makes Seismo one of the most difficult Vivosaurs to defeat because switching it out and putting it in the support zone all allow it more time to heal. The big downside to Seismo is that it has negative support effects for your side that harshly lowers your Vivosaur's defense and evasion. I would say that if you like the idea of having a Vivosaur that just keeps living and want to use Seismo, don't get it here. It is very difficult to find in the Sunken Ship and will become much easier to find in the future. First Vivosaur in the Greenhorn Plains play to dig site is Andoranch. Andoranch is an all-around class Vivosaur that excels in backing up other attack class Vivosaurs. It only gains access to damage dealing skills, but has 2 very good passive abilities at its disposal. The first of these abilities is Parting Blow. This allows Andoranch to power up when close to being defeated. For Andoranch, this means it gets a 300% boost to both its attack and accuracy stats, while getting a 150% boost to its defense and evasion stats. The other ability it gets is called Link. This allows Andoranch to follow up an attack from your attack zone Vivosaur. Link also only allows the Vivosaur to perform its weakest skill as a follow-up, and it does it 50% of the time, and is a really good way to add extra damage to your turn without having to spend extra FP to do it. With all that being said, there is no real downside to having an Andoranch on your team, and I would recommend it to people wanting a Vivosaur that helps to speed up battles. Next up is Carno. Carno is an Earth-type Vivosaur that specializes in pushing your opponents into their escape zone. It does this by using its moves that have a chance to knock the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur into their escape zone. Carno is also known as a lone wolf. This means that Carno is one of the few Vivosaurs in the game that does not have access to team attacks. This is something to keep in mind, but with Carno's large attack stat and ability to recover its own life points, it's not the biggest deal in the world. Overall, I wouldn't really recommend Carno, but it is useful if you want a Vivosaur that can control the positions of your opponents. After Carno is Karchar. Karchar is an attack class Vivosaur that really leans into the title. It gets access to both an Excite skill as well as the ability to push your opponent into their escape zone. The only other thing about Karchar is that it has a very large attack stat, which pairs perfectly with its upfront and in-your-face style of fighting. I would say that if you are looking for a strong Earth-type Vivosaur that gets some pretty good effects on its skills, then Karchar is a really good pick. Next up is Neo. Neo is a neutral-type Vivosaur as well as an attack class. There are two main things about Neo that pops out when first looking at it. The first is that it has several Excite skills that allow it to force opponents into a head-on battle. The second is that Neo has a lower than average defense stat, which isn't great since Neo will be taking neutral damage from any attack since it is a neutral type. Overall, I would say that if you want to use Neo, use it for the ability to control the opponent's positioning rather than the fact that it is a neutral attack class Vivosaur. The final Vivosaur found at this pay-to-dig site is Centro. Centro is our first example of an all-or-nothing Vivosaur. This means that it has a decent attack stat with a 100% chance to land a critical hit, but has abysmal accuracy to balance it out. There are a few ways to help increase your odds of hitting with Centro though. The first is that Centro has Parting Blow as a passive ability which raises its stats when under 10% of its total life point. Its attack and accuracy increase by 200%, while its other stats increase by 100%. The other way to try to negate Centro's low accuracy is by having good support effects on your other Vivosaurs to boost Centro. The only downside to this is that when you would be relying on Centro to be dealing the majority of the damage, which is a risky play. I would say that if you want to use Centro, you have to be prepared for a vast majority of your attacks to miss. If you plan for it, you can build your team in a way to allow Centro chances to use its critical hit chance without fully relying on it. Due to these restrictions, I can't really recommend using Centro, but it could be a fun build around if you wanted to. The first of the Vivosaurs found in Rivet Ravine's area number 1 is Hipsy. Hipsy is a support class Vivosaur that uses mostly Confused skills. Hipsy also gets access to an ability called Life Charge that allows it to heal any of the Vivosaurs on your side. This, along with its really good support effects, makes Hipsy a really good Vivosaur to put in the support zone just to give aid to your other Vivosaur. The downside to Hipsy is that it has abysmal stats almost across the board. This means that it can't really deal damage, take damage, or evade damage very well at all. I would say that Hipsy is for the players that want a purely support-based Vivosaur and are alright knowing that it can't really do anything else. After Hipsy is Goyle. Goyle is another long-range Vivosaur that only gets damage-dealing skills. Goyle does have the ability to use a special team attack if it is paired specifically with Pachy and Stygi. The main downside to that is that all of these Vivosaurs only have damage-dealing skills, so that if one is knocked out, they lose the only real reason to have all three of them teamed up in the first place. I would say that if you like Pachy or Stygi, but wanted them to be air type, then Goyle is exactly that. Next up is Metria. Metria is an all-around class Vivosaur that acts very similarly to an attack class. It has a decently high attack stat paired with a middle to low defense stat with mostly just damage dealing moves. All of this is to say that Metria's main purpose on a team is to be buff and hit things hard, which is not the worst thing that a Vivosaur could be used for. Overall, Metria is good for causing decent damage over the length of a fight, but also has alright support effects if it needs to be switched out of danger. And the final Vivosaur found in area number 1 is CMO. CMO is an attack class Vivosaur with stats almost exactly the same as Metria. CMO gains access to both a Scare skill as well as an Excite skill. With both of these skills, CMO excels in controlling what your opponent can do during the battle, from not being able to switch to completely taking away their ability to use some of their skills. CMO is really good at just stopping things that you don't want to happen from happening. This is also the main reason that I would personally recommend CMO. It isn't the strongest, but it is a reliable fire-type Vivosaur that just gives you the tools to control the flow of battle. The first of the Vivosaurs found in the BB base is Styraco. Styraco gets access to both an Enrage skill as well as a Scare skill. This makes Styraco really good at both making the opponents miss their skills or straight up stopping specific skills from being used. Styraco also has some pretty nice support effects, making your own attack zone Vivosaur hit more of their attacks, as well as more likely to dodge your opponent's attacks. Styraco is a good pickup for players that want a Vivosaur that can help their other Vivosaurs live longer while not being fully support oriented themselves. Next up is Dilafo. Dilafo is an all-around class Vivosaur whose main contribution to a team is building up FP faster than normal. Dilafo has a passive ability called FP+, which allows it to increase the rate that FP recharges each turn by 10%. However, Dilafo does have a couple of downsides. The first is that it really only gets damage dealing skills, which means it's not causing any statuses to hinder your opponent. The other downside is that it has a really weak defense, which means that if it's in the attack zone, it is likely to take an attack and be defeated. It's important to keep in mind that the FP+ ability only works if Dilafo is on the battlefield, though it is a bigger downside than it might seem at first. I would say that Dilafo is extremely valuable if kept on the battlefield long enough to get proper use out of that FP+ ability, but it does not have much else going for it. After Dilafo is Colo. Colo is a support class Vivosaur that has two major tools to help it in that role. The first is its support effects are amazing for buffing your own attack zone Vivosaur, and the second tool is that it learns the ability called Neutralize. Neutralize allows Colo to target one of your own Vivosaurs and completely remove all statuses that are affecting it. This is awesome because we have only really been able to remove statuses by switching the Vivosaur that is statused into the escape zone, but by doing that, it could cause problems in team layout and type effectiveness. But by having the skill Neutralize on your team, you completely remove the need to switch your strong Vivosaurs out of the attack zone just to get rid of those negative status effects. One thing to keep in mind is that the wording of the skill is eliminate all effects. This means that both negative and positive status effects will be removed if used, which could make things more difficult. Colo is a reliable support Vivosaur that both buffs your side and stops all unwanted status effects all at once. Next up is Kentro. Kentro is a defensive class Vivosaur that has the ability to make any of your other Vivosaurs very defensive as well. Kentro gets a positive status effect that buffs your attack zone Vivosaur's defense, but also eventually gets a skill that allows it to greatly increase a targeted Vivosaur's defense as well. Those two things combine to make pretty much any Vivosaur in your attack zone an iron wall. For example, take Spinax, which is a Vivosaur everyone gets access to since it's the starting Vivosaur. Spinax has 36 base defense at rank 12. It then gets 50 points increase by Kentro's Golden Harden skill, which brings it up to 86 points. Finally, the support effect raises it by 30%, bringing Spinax, who started at 36 points of defense, to 112 points of defense. That is higher than every single legendary Vivosaur in the game by almost 50 points. I would be completely fine recommending Kentro just for the ability to make the most defensive Vivosaurs ever, but it also gets the skill to confuse your opponents on top of all that. With that being said, Kentro is an amazing choice for anyone that likes using 1 to 2 attack class Vivosaurs for most battles, but wants them to be able to survive longer within those battles. Next up after Kentro is Pelto. Pelto is a defensive class Vivosaur that can spread around several different status effects. It gets access to both an Excite skill as well as a Sleep skill, which is a huge upside because only a select few Vivosaurs get any Sleep skills. Pelto also gets the Harden skill, but unlike Kentro, it is only the silver version. I would say that Pelto is almost like the opposite of Kentro. because while Kentro likes to sit in the support zone and buff your Vivosaurs, Poto likes to sit in the support zone and nerf your opponents. So if you didn't like Kentro because you like Vivosaurs that more directly affect your opponents, then Poto is the Vivosaur for you. The next Vivosaur found here is Salto. Unfortunately, Salto is one of those Vivosaurs that I just flat out don't recommend using. Salto is a long-range Vivosaur with the ability to raise the defense of your Vivosaurs with its Harden skill, and that's about where the positives of Salto stop. The negatives of using Salto are that it has a negative support effects for your attack zone. It gets an auto counter skill, but won't be able to use it much since the AI doesn't attack the support zone very much at all. So you may think with those two things that, oh, I'll just put it in the attack zone and use it like an attack class. But unlike other Vivosaurs that I would recommend using that way, Salto neither has the stats nor the skill power to back up that strategy. Like I said, I wouldn't recommend using Salto, but if you do, the best strategy I could come up with is for it to use its scare skill from the support zone to deal some damage, and to try to stop your opponents from using their skills. And we are ending on a high note from the BB base with Displeto. Displeto is an attack class Vivosaur that works really well as one. Displeto has both a really high attack stat as well as a really decent defense stat to back that up. This makes Displeto almost perfectly suited for long drawn-out battles with it sitting in the attack zone. Displeto also gains access to a scare skill, which allows it to take skills away from your opponent, which also makes Displeto even harder to defeat. Overall, if you are looking for a Vivosaur that can take a head-on attack and then hit back even harder, then Displeto is a great choice. First Vivosaur found in Mount Lava Flow is Jara. Looking only at its stats makes it look very weak, having less than 50 points in any of its stats, which would make you think it's pretty useless in a fight, but it actually has several skills that help make your other Vivosaurs more effective to make up for the stats. The first of these skills is the ability to inflict a golden sleep status, which allows your other Vivosaurs to attack that Vivosaur twice before it's able to do anything in response. The second skill allows it to steal up to 120 FP from your opponent, which allows you to use more skills per turn and also causes your opponent to have less options per turn. The last skill that Jara gets is basically a latch ditch effort move. It causes Jara to go down to 1 life point in exchange to doing 180 damage to the targeted Vivosaur. Due to Jara's stats, it's likely that this is the only way Jara will do a lot of damage to a Vivosaur at all, and it's a good thing to know that no matter how much life that Jara sacrifices, it will always do 180 damage. This all makes Jara a really good Vivosaur for promoting the strengths of your other Vivosaurs, while also making come from behind victories more likely to happen. Next up is Guan. Guan is our first example of a Transformation class Vivosaur. Transformation class Vivosaurs are classified as relatively weak Vivosaurs that have skills that allow them to become stronger Vivosaurs. In these transformations, the Vivosaurs take on everything that makes the Vivosaurs that they are transforming into. This includes everything from support effects, skills, stats, typings, and even their class. In the case of Guan, its fourth ability is called Great Unmasking, and allows it to transform into the powerful T-Rex. This does several things for Guan. It becomes an attack class with detrimental support effects for your attack zone. It also gets an attack stat that is the max that is possible within the game at 99 points. It is important for me to mention that the actual T-Rex is not possible to get during the main story, so if you wanted to use the T-Rex, then this is the only real way to do it during the main story of the game. But even without the transformation skill, Guan can be a really powerful ally on its own. More specifically because of its support effects. It boosts your attack zone Vivosaur's attack by 90%, which is one of the highest increases from a support effect in the game. So if you plan to use Guan on your team, the way I would use it is by having it play as like a support class Vivosaur while it's a Guan, and in a desperate circumstance, you can switch it into the attack zone and transform, just wreaking havoc with the T-Rex. After Guan is Jiango. The best way I can describe Jiango is a fire-type Kentro with a few key differences. One of the differences is that it gets an extra 10% to both its defense and evasion support effects for your attack zone. Another difference is that Jiango gets an Excite skill, rather than the Confuse skill that Kentro gets. And while their stats are almost exactly the same, only really being off by 1 or 2 points in each of the stats, Jiango actually has a significantly lower life point total. Since I recommended Kentro, it only really makes sense that I also recommend Jiango. Just keep in mind the differences and the strength of massively increasing your own other Vivosaur's defense. Next up is Tro. Tro is an all-around class Vivosaur that has some amazing support effects that raise your attack zone Vivosaur stats by 40% each. This alone makes many attack class Vivosaurs monsters when paired with it. Other than the support effects, Tro also gets the ability to inflict poison on the enemy, as well as inflame on your own Vivosaur. This, along with the heightened chance to land critical hits, helps to strengthen Tro's own middling attack stat if it needs to do some damage during battle. But other than that, just let Tro be a support Vivosaur that it has always wanted to be. After Tro is Saichan. Saichan can technically be found previous in the BB base on the 5th floor, but it's so rare to find there that I decided to wait to talk about it until now. Saichan is a defensive class that excels in spreading around status effects to both your opponents as well as your own Vivosaur. It gains access to a Confuse, an Excite, and a Harden skill. Basically, Saichan is really good at making it difficult for your opponents to hit you, while also making your Vivosaurs more defensive to take the attacks whenever they are able to land any. Juno! A long-range class Vivosaur that has the ability to inflict scare on your opponents. Its scare skill costs 140 FP, which means that at this point in the game, you can fire it off every single turn if you wanted to. This is good to help spread around scare to try to limit what skills your opponents have access to. The biggest downside to Shootout is that it has negative support effects for your own attack zone, so just keep that in mind if you plan to use it. Next up is Penta. Penta is another user of the Parting Blow passive ability, raising its attack and accuracy by 300% and its other stats by 150 when its life points fall below 10%. Other than this, Penta also gets access to an Excite skill, which helps make other Vivosaurs easier to revenge kill if they knock Penta down to its Parting Blow level. Sacrifice also allows Penta to give life points back to its allies in exchange for sending its own life points to 1. All of these things help Penta support other Vivosaurs until it's needed to fight back in tough situations. After Penta is Amargo. Amargo is a user of the power scale abilities that allows it to take all of your own FP and all of your opponent's FP and split the total between the players evenly. This means that if you use it when you have next to no FP, it can actually cause you to gain FP to use more skills while simultaneously taking FP away from your opponent. Amargo, similarly to Shuno, gets a scare skill that you can use constantly to pressure your opponent. Along the same line, Amargo actually has negative support effects, so keep that in mind and use Amargo for messing with the FP levels of your opponent after defeating one of their Vivosaurs. And the final Vivosaur found in the volcano is Igno. Igno is another user of the Parting Blow passive that increases its attack and accuracy by 200% and its other stats by 100% when under 10% of its life. But its real claim to fame is that it has the support effects that halves the opponent's evasion. This paired with another Vivosaur that has a high critical hit chance can be a lethal combo. This doesn't even mention that Igno gets access to an Inflame skill to raise the attack stat of a Vivosaur to make the combo even more deadly. Krona is a rank 6 all-around class Vivosaur. She has several confused skills that makes her really irritating to fight in a prolonged battle. On top of that, she has some of the best support effects we've seen on a Vivosaur. The lucky thing is, she starts in the attack zone, though she is not taking advantage of those support effects at the start of this battle. Although she is very likely to switch positions very quickly, as you can see from my battle. There are a couple of things to keep in mind in this battle in particular. The first is that Duna is very threatening in her own right. Along with her Confused skill, she also gets a skill called Enchanting Aura, which allows her to place the counter status on herself. This causes her to take less damage from the next hit she takes, as well as inflicting a portion of that damage back on the attacking Vivosaur. All of this is to say to just focus on defeating her and worry about the other two after. The second thing to keep in mind is her support effects. Like I said, they are very good, so if she switches into the escape zone for any reason, focus on trying to take out the two Dino Matins before she returns to the battle. If you are unable to, it makes the battle much more difficult because he's just buffing them to Kingdom Come. Just remember, Duna is a very dangerous Vivosaur, so force her into the escape zone, status her, or focus on damage, but don't allow her to control your Vivosaurs like she wants to. Frigi is a monster. To be clear, this is Frigi OP, and yes, that is important. Frigi OP is our first example of a legendary Vivosaur, and as its name would imply, it is OP. It has completely maxed out stats and literally cannot be touched in this battle. That, with the fact that it cannot be statused at all, it can attack all of your Vivosaurs at once, and it completely disables all support effects, truly makes it what Bulwark called it, the ultimate Vivosaur. We can fight back with a monster of our own in Igno. To be more specific, Igno OP. Igno is our first legendary Vivosaur that we actually have the ability to use. Igno is also the counterpart to Frigi, which means it boasts maxed out stats and a complete immunity to status effects. Unlike Frigi, Igno cannot attack all of your opponent's Vivosaurs at once, but in exchange for that, it does have a Golden Inflame skill, which increases any of your other Vivosaur's attack stats. Remember that Igno already has maxed out stats, making this status on it completely useless. Igno also has a passive ability, Auto LP Recovery, which basically makes Igno OP undefeatable, as it recovers 100% of its total life points each turn. So any damage that it had taken will be recovered at the start of your turn. This means that the only real way to defeat Igno OP is to hit it for all of its life points in a single turn, which is incredibly difficult. Other than that, just put it in the attack zone and deal massive damage to your opponents. Also, yes, the images used for both Igno and Frigi are from the sequel game Fossil Fighters Champions, because there are no images of their Dino medals from this game that I could find. First Vivosaur found here is Tricera. Tricera is a mainstay for anyone who's played the sequel, and it's just as good in this one. Tricera is a user of the Parting Blow ability, meaning that when its life points drop to 10% or lower, it gains a 300% boost in both its attack and accuracy stats, while gaining a 150% boost in its other two stats. On top of that, it has the ability to knock your opponents into the escape zone, as well as being able to cause the Enrage status and Inflame status. All of this, along with its pretty good support effects and decent stats, makes it so Tricera can sit really in any position on the battlefield and be helpful to you. Next up is Bronchio. Bronchio is not a great Vivosaur. Let's start with the good. It has a skill that has a 100% chance to swap your opponent's zones, which is useful to disrupt their plans. It also has Power Scale, which allows you to equalize the FP of you and your opponent. Unfortunately, Bronchio is hindered by both its straight up bad support effects and its lacking stats. Due to these things, Bronchio feels more like a gimmick Vivosaur that you would only really use to swap around your opponent's Vivosaurs, but it's not really good in any position itself. Now we're on to a real gimmick Vivosaur with Xeno. Xeno's whole thing is that it has a 100% chance to land a critical hit when it hits an attack, but it has an abysmal accuracy stat. There are a few ways to increase the odds, like positive support effects to increase its accuracy, or activating its Parting Blow ability, but honestly, I would just leave Xeno to remain as the gimmick that it is. Next up is Megath. Megath is an all-around class that has several confused skills. It also eventually gets the ability to possibly counter certain skills from your opponents. Other than the statuses that Megath can inflict, it also has a passive ability, Parting Blow, which increases its attack and accuracy by 300%, and its other statuses by 150% when it's at 10% or lower life total. This all makes Megath able to control the flow of battle with its statuses, while being able to finish battles with its stat increases in a pinch if needed. Nodo is a defensive class Vivosaur that likes to sit in the support zone and buff the defense of your attack zone. Other than that, Nodo has a Confuse skill as well as the ability to equalize the FP total of you and your opponent. On the other hand, Nodo has pretty bad stats that make it a liability if it's left to handle your opponents by itself. Just make sure to keep your other Vivosaurs alive and Nodo becomes a great asset in battle. And the final Vivosaur found in the secret tunnels is Shanshan. The big things about Shanshan are that its support effects halves your opponent's defense, and it has skills that are impossible to counter. Shanshan also gets access to several scare skills, as well as a golden harden skill to raise the defense of your own Vivosaurs. Overall, Shanshan is great at just sitting in the support zone and inflicting scare while nerfing your opponents. First up in Rivet Ravine area number 2 is Igno. Honestly, there's not a whole ton to go over for Igno. It has decent support effects as well as a skill to inflict Confuse. Other than that, it has a counter skill as well, but even with all those things, its stats are pretty middling, especially in this late in the game. I would say to skip using it, but you could probably get some type of use out of Igno if you chose to add it to your team. Next up is Lambio. Finally, we get to see what Metal Dealer Joe's eyes look like. It's only been like 20 episodes or whatever. But anyway, Lambio likes to sit in the attack zone and spread around both Enrage and Excite, while dealing massive damage with its equally massive attack stat. Other than that, Lambio has one of the most useful team attacks that we have ever seen. It's called Healing Hand, and it recovers 100 life points to both of your other Vivosaurs. The only downside to this team skill is that it costs 280 FP, so you would probably only be doing that on the turn that you decided to use that team attack. With that said, I would recommend Lambio, even this late into the game. You have to make sure that your team has the correct groupings to allow it to use that team attack, but it's a very powerful Vivosaur that has the ability to support your other Vivosaurs in dire situations if you do so. S-Raptor is an attack class Vivosaur that specializes in knocking your opponents into the escape zone. 2 out of its 4 skills allow it to do this, and it's actually super helpful to stop opponents with a lot of buffs, or just to remove a Vivosaur that you don't particularly want to deal with at the current moment. Other than that, S-Raptor is one of the very few Vivosaurs that does not have access to any team skills, meaning that if you choose to add S-Raptor to your team, you are trading in the use of team skills whenever you use it. S-Raptor also has some pretty middling stats compared to the other Vivosaurs that we could get well before this point. So with that and the loss of team skills, I wouldn't really recommend using it for really much of anything besides knocking your opponents into their escape zone. And the final Vivosaur for area number 2 is Alio. The way I would describe Alio is that it's basically a stronger version of the various different Raptors we've seen besides the U-Raptor. The reason I say this is because that it deals almost exclusively in skills that cause poison, and it doesn't really have any support effects, so putting it in the support zone doesn't actually affect your team at all. So if you have been using the Raptors and were bummed that there wasn't like a water type Raptor that you could use, Alio fits the same playstyle and even brings along some extra power to help even out your team a bit. After area number 2, we have Rivet Ravine's Pay to Dig site with its first Vivosaur, Giganto. Giganto has a pretty respectable attack stat and poison skills to help deal even more damage. On the other hand, the rest of its stats are middling to bad, but since Giganto is an attack class that is really focused on just dealing as much damage as physically possible, the lower stats are not really an issue. I would say that if you are still looking for a water type this late into the game, you could do a lot worse than adding Giganto to your team. Next is Pachy. Pachy can do a ton of things, from being able to knock your opponents into their escape zone and inflicting Vivosaurs with the Enraged status or the Hardened status, to being a user of the Parting Blow ability and having access to a really nice defense increasing support effect. Pachy really lives up to its all-around class. The only real downside is its pretty weak stats, and that downside can be avoided by focusing on statuses or using its Parting Blow passive ability in sticky situations. Also, I just want to gush about its design for a second. The only way I know how to do this is like a kid who's trying to tell you about their new toy, so I'm just gonna lean into that. It's a Triceratops dressed up as a military army tank. It's so cool and an awesome design for a bulky Vivosaur based on military equipment. Okay, now with that out of my system, on to the next Vivosaur. Acro is an all-around class Vivosaur with a high attack stat. Acro also has a decent support effect that raises the attack stat of your other Vivosaurs as well. The main downside to Acro is that it only really deals in damage-dealing skills, but with the good attack stat and the ability to switch around without any consequences, makes this downside not really matter all too often. Overall, I would say that Acro is a pretty basic Vivosaur, but sometimes having something that is basic and reliable is just what you need. After Acro is Dimorph. There are two things that make Dimorph a really good long-range Vivosaur. The first is its support effects that nerfs your opponent's attack zone Vivosaur's stats by 25% each. Dimorph also has access to both a silver and a gold version of Enraged skills, which means that it's nuking your opponent's accuracy as well. All that together makes your opponent's attack zone Vivosaur basically useless, because even if it can hit through the accuracy drops of the Enraged status and the support effects, its attack is dropped by those same support effects, so it's basically doing no damage anyway. If you are still looking for a fire type or a long-range Vivosaur, I highly recommend Dimorph because of these reasons. And the final Vivosaur in the pay-to-dig dig site is Paraloft. There are a ton of things in Paraloft's favor. It gets access to several different status skills like a Confuse skill, an Enraged skill, and a Counter skill. Paraloft also gets some pretty decent support effects that increase all of your attack zone Vivosaur's stats by a nice 7% each, making pretty much any of your other Vivosaurs better on the battlefield. And all of that is on top of stats that are comparable to Spinax's stats. And I think I've shown that Spinax is a pretty great Vivosaur to use. And Paraloft has the status skills with those stats, so it could very easily be seen as better than Spinax. Paraloft is a true all-around class Vivosaur that I can easily recommend. I know, Matt! It is a basically just strictly damage-dealing Vivosaur. It is a robot that the Dinorians have created, so it also has the ability to have complete immunity from all statuses. It's one of the only Vivosaurs in this game, other than the legendary ones that we've seen, that have that ability. Another thing it has is it has 90 base attack stat at level 12, so it is a monster at attacking. So you kind of want to make sure you take as much damage out of it as possible so it can't use its team skills as much, because using the team skills it's able to attack your entire party with that massive attack stat. Other than all of that, it really doesn't have too much going for it. The basic strategy for fighting the Dinomatons is just to bring your strongest Vivosaurs and hit them hard. Since you can't inflict statuses, don't try to do anything like poison or anything, which is something I may or may not have almost tried to do. But if you just do all of that, you should be perfectly fine in this fight. The first Vivosaur found on the secret island is Proto, and it is almost completely useless. The whole thing that it can do is transform into Tricera. The only thing is, we've had access to get a normal Tricera for 2 full chapters now, so having a weaker Vivosaur that can transform into it is simply worse in almost every single way. Talking about Proto by itself, it has some of the worst stats of any Vivosaur in the entire game. The only redeeming thing that Proto has about it is that it has really nice support effects, and it has the ability to inflict Super Harden, which sounds a lot worse when I say it out loud. But regardless, my recommendation is to get Proto for the completion and throw it into VMM machine, never to be seen again. Next up is Chirrus. Chirrus does one thing and one thing only. It has a support effect that decreases your opponent's Vivosaur's evasion by 99%. That basically means every Vivosaur in your opponent's attack zone has 1 evasion, which means all of your attacks are virtually guaranteed to hit. So a really good strategy that you could do with Chirrus is by pairing it with a Vivosaur that has a 100% chance to critical hit, since the nerf to your opponent's evasion counteracts the low accuracy that those Vivosaurs have. Meaning that you could theoretically get massively damaging critical hits every single turn. And with legendary Vivosaurs not being weak to any type and Dino-Matins running around, being able to crit every single turn is a massive upside. An active Chirrus is Sopteryx. Sopteryx is basically the opposite of Chirrus by increasing the evasion of your Vivosaurs by a very large amount, which makes them virtually untouchable. On top of that, Sopteryx also has the FP plus passive ability to help you gain more FP each turn, and a skill to heal your other Vivosaurs. All of this makes Sopteryx a really good support class Vivosaur. Just make sure to watch out for your opponent switching your positions, since the thing cannot take hits. Maya is a support class Vivosaur that takes the title to the extreme. It has only a single damage dealing skill, that being its very first one, and all of Maya's other skills are entirely focused on supporting its allies. Its second skill allows it to remove all status effects, while its third and fourth skill allow it to heal either a targeted Vivosaur or all of your other Vivosaurs by 80 life points. Even Maya's team skill is focused on support, healing all of your allies by 60 life points. Basically, Maya is for the players that choose to play healers in every other game, because you may not be doing a lot of damage, but by God, your tank and DPS will live forever. Next up is Bream. Say hello to the best conman after Metal Dealer Joe. Bream specializes in taking everything you've ever loved. And by that I mean life points and FP. The trade-off for the ability to take from your opponent is that Bream is pretty lacking in the stats department, having both pretty low life points and weak attack. And when damage dealt is how the game determines how many life points you steal, you could probably see how that could be a problem. Bream is a really interesting idea and has really cool mechanics, but it just becomes available too late in the game to make the best use out of those things. After Bream is Hoplo. Hoplo is a cute little kitty cat support class that has almost no ways of actually supporting your other Vivosaurs. Hoplo has exactly 3 ways to supply support. It can inflict Quicken on your Vivosaurs. It has both positive and negative support effects for your Vivosaurs, so I'm not even sure that one counts. And it has the FP plus passive abilities. Out of all 3 of these things, the FP plus ability is by far the best, since it just allows you to do more on your turns. Other than that, Hoplo has 3 strictly damage dealing skills, and with its 59 attack, it's not going to be doing any real damage with them. You're better off just getting it for completion and skip trying to make it work, but it does have a really awesome design. Next up is the final raptor found in the game, the Ouraptor. The Ouraptor focuses on having dirt cheap skills that steal your opponent's FP in order to charge your other Vivosaurs. The main downside to the Ouraptor is that it only has 47 attack, meaning that it will not be outputting almost any damage, especially if it's in the support zone. The Ouraptor is best used with an attack class Vivosaur with high cost skills, since it has the ability to slow down your opponent and make your Vivosaur more able to actually get the FP that is required to use their high costed skills. And the final Vivosaur found on the secret island is Psyduck! Wait a second. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong notes. But let's see here. Oh, here it is. Anato! is a support class Vivosaur that can inflict confuse on the opponent. Onyx also has the ability to sacrifice its own life points to heal its allies. Other than that, Onyx really has nothing else going for it. Man, I wish I was actually talking about Psyduck. Maybe someday. Raptor is a level 8 attack class Vivosaur. He has some awful support effects that negatively affect your side by a massive amount. But similarly to Duna, he starts in the attack zone in this fight, so it's not the biggest issue. The other thing about Raptor to keep in mind is that he has several poison effect skills. So basically he has skills that can poison you, including one that has a 100% success rate, which can be a real problem if you just allow him to keep firing that off. He also has the ability to greatly increase any of the Vivosaurs on his side's evasion, which is incredibly scary when his support skills also lower your accuracy. So the way to defeat him is basically exactly the same as Duna. Hit him very hard. Don't allow him to really escape, and if he does, take out the Dino Mountains before he's able to really recover at all. Dino, King of the Dinorians, is a level 8 attack class Vivosaur, similarly to Raptor. He comes equipped with the worst support effects we've seen in the entire game, as well as a 100% chance to inflict Excite as well as Poison on 2 of his different skills, as you have seen on my Spinax. He also has the ability to greatly increase the attack of one of the Vivosaurs on his side. A strategy I have not talked about for any of the Dinorians that I probably should have by this point is inflicting Excite on them. Basically what it does is it will make them unable to switch zones, keeping you from having to deal with their support effects at all, since they start in the attack zone at the beginning of each of the battles. Dino, when he is rank 12, has maxed out attack stats and is just straight up a monster. He is exactly how the description of him is described. He is indeed the king of the Dinorians. Gavorn, the attack class brain that has maxed out attack and the most life points of any of the brains. These things make it almost perfectly created to sit in the attack zone. Gavorn also comes equipped with a scare skill to help it control how many skills an opponent can use, as well as 2 different ways to raise other Vivosaur's attack to its monstrous level. The first is its support effects that raise attack by 10% if it were to ever switch out of the attack zone. And the other way is that Gavorn has a Golden Inflame skill, which raises the infected Vivosaur's attack by 40 points. These 2 things allow Gavorn to completely max out the attack of the other 2 brains, which is incredibly scary and something to watch out for if the brains start switching around. Goyle, the defensive class brain that specializes in increasing the defense of other Vivosaurs. Goyle has both a Golden Harden skill and support effects that increase defense, which is enough to make Gavorn's defense 94 and Goweep's defense 74. This is on top of the fact that using just a Harden skill can make Goyle's defense maxed out, which makes it incredibly tanky and pairs perfectly with its auto counter ability. Goyle also has almost complete control on where your opponent's Vivosaurs are positioned, because it has both a skill that randomly swaps around your opponent's Vivosaurs, and an Excite skill that makes it so those Vivosaurs can't switch again afterwards. All of this makes Goyle really suited at controlling both sides of the battlefield and taking advantage of all of those switch-ups. So Weep, the support class brain. So at this point you might be asking yourself, how can there be a more supportive Vivosaur than Goyle was? And the answer to that question is that Goyle is nowhere even close. Goyle is by far the weakest of the brains and focuses on increasing the evasion of its team. Goyle is tied with Goyle for having the lowest life point total of the three brains at 666, but Goyle is massively hindered by the fact that it only has 18 defense. I say that all to show that Goyle is very weak compared to all of the other legendary Vivosaurs, but to also say that you should take it out first. Goyle presents itself as a target that can be forgotten until later, but it comes equipped with a skill that can heal the other Vivosaurs on its team, and paired with the fact that any of them can have almost max defense, thanks to Goyle, can be incredibly scary to deal with. The best ways to handle it are to focus it from the start, or to force it into the attack zone and handle it while one of the other brains are in the escape zone. First up is Ourano! Ourano has one really big thing going for it and nothing else, and that is its support effect that effectively doubles your attack zone Vivosaur's accuracy. This just allows your low accuracy Vivosaurs to hit more often. On the other hand, Ourano has both bad stats and bad skills, making it really difficult to use for almost any of these post-game battles that are left when you get access to it. Basically, get it if you're going for completion, but I wouldn't really recommend trying to use it. And in the same vein as Ourano is Smilo. By that I mean that the main thing about Smilo is its really high support effect. The difference is that Smilo actually increases stats that are helpful, being the defense and evasion of your attack zone. Smilo also has the FP plus passive skill, which helps you gain more FP each turn, which can be incredibly helpful in these hard post-game battles. Smilo is definitely easier to recommend, but purely as a support Vivosaur. After Smilo is Arsith. Arsith is actually really good at controlling the battlefield. It comes equipped with two golden skills, being a sleep and an inflame skill. It also has the option of just knocking your opponent's attack zone Vivosaur into their escape zone for only 80 FP. On top of all that, Arsith also has decent support effects to help boost your team even more. The only real downside to Arsith is that it has some pretty lackluster stats, but if you are using it correctly, these stats shouldn't be the biggest downside. Next up is Opteryx. Opteryx is our final transformation class Vivosaur, and it has the ability to transform into 10 different Vivosaurs, technically making it the most versatile Vivosaur of all of them. The only downside is that you don't get to choose which Vivosaur you transform into, making it a pretty big gamble. We also have access to every single Vivosaur in this group except for one, and that one is fairly weak due to what that Vivosaur is for. So if you want to use Opteryx for the chance of using one or more of those Vivosaurs, then you should really just go get those real Vivosaurs from the places that they're at. Besides its transforming gimmick, Opteryx has alright support effects and 2 skills to steal FP from your opponent, which can be helpful. But Opteryx also comes equipped with a whole 5 defense, making it about as defensive as a wet piece of paper. So anything that hit Opteryx will defeat it, and because of that and the unreliable nature of its transforming ability, Opteryx just becomes pretty unusable. After Opteryx is Aloe, and we finally find a Vivosaur here that could do some type of damage. Aloe is an all-around class Vivosaur that specializes in stopping your opponents from switching zones using its Excite skills. Aloe also has 88 attack, meaning that when it traps your opponents in the attack zone, it can do some real damage to them. Aloe also gets the Law of the Jungle skill, which allows it to steal life points from your other Vivosaurs to heal itself, making it live longer and deal even more damage. All of this is to say that Aloe is a big dino and likes to smack around Vivosaurs and is really good at it. Next up is the walking city of Perso. So, just being straight up, Perso is bad. It has pretty basic skills, but all of them are really expensive and are pretty weak, making all of them really bad. Perso also has strictly negative support effects. the biggest thing that Perso has going for it is its life point stat. A massive 720 life points is really nice, but if you aren't doing anything with the extended time you get from having so much life, then there really isn't much of a point. Mihu! If you like doing a ton of damage, boy do I have the Vivosaur for you. Mihu has a 60% increase to attack for its support effects. This by itself can make a Vivosaur with even a middling attack stat of 50 become a great attack stat of 80, which also means that any Vivosaur with the at least 62 attack gets maxed out attack with this 60% boost. On top of this, Mihu also gets access to a counter skill, which helps to keep your Vivosaurs healthy by deflecting damage, as well as a skill that allows it to knock the opponent's attack zone Vivosaur into the escape zone. Using these basically makes it really good at controlling the battlefield and incredible at supporting any Vivosaur that you would put in the attack zone. After Mihu is Gorgo. Gorgo is an attack class Vivosaur that comes equipped with a Scare skill to help block skills from your opponent's Vivosaurs. Unfortunately, Gorgo doesn't really have anything else going for it. At this point, I might sound like a broken record, but Gorgo has negative support effects for your side and skills that are just slightly too expensive to make the best use out of Gorgo. I would just recommend not taking very much time to try to use it, especially because there's a better attack class Vivosaur in this very desert. And that is the monstrous T-Rex. Known as the most powerful attack class Vivosaur, the T-Rex boasts an incredible maxed out attack stat and amazing skills to use it with. It has a skill that hits all of your opponent's Vivosaurs at once, as well as 2 skills that inflict scare on their Vivosaurs. On top of that, the T-Rex also gets the skill Law of the Jungle, which just lets it steal life points from its allies to heal itself. And with 600 life points and 50 defense, this can just make the T-Rex an even more irritating Vivosaur to deal with. All that being said, this is the only Vivosaur that I can truly recommend to replace one of your team members. That's how strong it is. The first Vivosaur found at Cold Feet Glacier is Cryo. Cryo is an all-around class Vivosaur that has a 100% success rate combo all within itself. It gets access to an Excite skill to stop the opponent's Vivosaur from switching zones, as well as a Golden Poison skill that can guarantee great damage when they can't switch around. Other than that combo, Cryo also gets some pretty good support effects and a decent attack stat. With all of these things, I could recommend Cryo since it works pretty well in any zone you can put it in. Next up is Spino. Spino boasts a great 80 attack stat with several poison skills that can be used to deal even more damage. This sounds great, but the downside is that the poison skills only have, at max, a 50% chance of poisoning your opponent, which means it's not really a reliable source of damage. And without that source of damage, Spino becomes a pretty middling attack class Vivosaur with awful support effects. I wouldn't recommend Spino, but if you want to use it, focus on boosting its attack and defense and trying to get that poison to go off as much as possible. After Spino is Apatto. Apatto has 2 things that make it pretty good and 2 things that make it pretty bad. Apatto has a skill that allows it to swap around your opponent's Vivosaurs randomly, which can be helpful to interrupt their plans and to get rid of a Vivosaur that you don't want to deal with at the beginning. Apatto can also sacrifice its own life points to heal its allies. On the other hand, Apatto has pretty bad support effects, which makes it difficult to want to put in the support zone, but it also has middling to bad stats, which makes you not want to put it into the attack zone. So there really is nowhere where Apatto feels like it would really work well. So that's the good and the bad. Now you can decide if it's ugly. Next up is Ankylo. Ankylo is a defensive class Vivosaur that is even more capable at maxing out other Vivosaur's defense than the legendary Galith is. To show this, any Vivosaur with at least 20 defense gets to max defense with Ankylo's support effect and harden skill. Ankylo can also do other things like inflict, confuse, and poison at relatively high success rates. That being said, if you are having trouble with your Vivosaurs being defeated too quickly, Inkolo can help fix that problem. Just be prepared to attack slightly more, since Inkolo also lowers your attack zone Vivosaur's attack. Pachy! This mermaid dog has several things going for it. Pachy can both lower your opponent's attack while raising your Vivosaur's defense, which can make your Vivosaurs very difficult to defeat from pure damage. Pachy also gets the Parting Blow ability to help boost its middling stats when it's at low life. The main downside to Pachy is that it only has damage dealing attack skills, but it does have the Link passive ability to help deal a little more damage without costing any extra FP. I would say that Pachy is a pretty good Vivosaur, but at this point it might be a little late to get the best use out of it. After Pachy is Turbo. Turbo is the only air-type Vivosaur found in either of the post-game dig sites, and it's actually pretty good for this late in the game. I like to compare Turbo to the very first Vivosaur we ever got, Spinax, since they are very similar. Turbo has slightly higher attack, both in its stat and its skills, while Spinax has better support effects being positive while Turbo has negative ones. The biggest difference is between their last skills though. Spinax's last skill is Harden, which raises the Vivosaur's defense, while Turbo's last skill is Law of the Jungle, which steals your other Vivosaur's life points to heal itself. So basically, if you like Spinax, Turbo is pretty equivalent and can be used in many of the same situations. Next up is Brontoth. Brontoth is a support class Vivosaur and works really well as one. It gets access to a Golden Poison skill as well as an Inflame skill. Brontoth can also knock your opponent's Vivosaurs into their escape zone if you decide you don't want to deal with them first. Its support effects raise the defense and accuracy of your attack zone, which when mixed with its Inflame skill, raises 3 of the 4 main stats of your attack zone for almost no downside. All of this makes Brontoth just a really good support class and pretty recommended if you still need a support class. After Brontoth is the Vivosaur that picked the short straw at the naming convention, Tucko. Tucko has the exact same combo as Cryo, but is just worse at doing it. It has both an Excite skill and a Poison skill, but the Poison skill only has a 50% chance of actually inflicting the Vivosaur that it hits. This, combined with only 75 attack and bad support effects, makes Tucko, frankly, kind of suck. Guerra! A long-range Vivosaur that specializes in being the most irritating Vivosaur you have ever seen. Guerra gets access to 3 regular skills that each have a different effect meant to irritate the opponent. Guerra's first skill simply inflicts the Golden Sleep status, meaning that 2 more attacks can hit that Vivosaur without waking it up. Guerra's second skill has a 100% chance of swapping the zones of the opponent's Vivosaurs, and finally, its third skill just steals 180 FP from their opponent. On top of all that, Guerra also has pretty decent support effects to help your other Vivosaurs even more, making it a pretty good Vivosaur, if not a really annoying Vivosaur. And the final Vivosaur in these post-game dig sites is Mammoth. Mammoth works really well in the support zone. Between its good support effects and the fact that it can heal your other Vivosaurs by sacrificing its own life points, Mammoth helps your other Vivosaurs become even more capable on the battlefield. Talking about Mammoth's sacrifice skill, Mammoth is also one of only 3 Vivosaurs that gets access to the Auto LP Recovery passive skill, which means that Mammoth heals slowly over time and can then sacrifice again, healing your other Vivosaurs even more. Mammoth's stats are not great, but I can only see positives with Mammoth, and if you are using Mammoth correctly, these stats should not be the biggest problem ever. Trima! Trima is a personal favorite Vivosaur of mine. It is an all-around class Vivosaur with pretty good support effects and dirt cheap skills with some pretty good statuses. Trima also gets the Parting Blow passive ability and Link passive ability, and both of these things allow Trima to deal extra damage for no cost and power up if it's in danger. All of these things make Trima an amazing Vivosaur, if you could find it within the first 3 or 4 areas. Let me put this in perspective. after Trima, we are going to get 6 more Vivosaurs, and realistically, you could only get a max of 11 more. It is simply too late in the game to get proper use out of Trima, which sucks, because it's awesome. Igno! While not the same Igno that we had access to earlier in the story, this Igno comes equipped with the exact same skills and the Parting Blow ability, as well as a maxed out attack stat. Igno also lost the Auto LP recovery ability, and in exchange, received some absolutely awful support effects. Overall, Igno is still very powerful, it's just nerfed from its monstrous form we once had. Frigi! While not the same Frigi that we fought with the BB boss, this Frigi still boasts a max out attack stat and a skill that can hit both the attack zone and the support zone of the opponent. The main difference between the two Frigis are that the stats are lower and the abysmal support effects, even for a long-range class Vivosaur. None of this is to say that Frigi is bad though, in fact it's very much the opposite. There is a reason it is legendary. Have all of them at rank 12. If you go to the fossil center and then go to the cleaning room, if you go to the upper, I believe it's the upper left hand corner of the cleaning room, there is an aid there that will give you fossil eggs, and if you clean those fossil eggs, then you will revive 5 more Vivosaurs, and those Vivosaurs are Squirth, Squelk, and Squirro. And I think that we need to go over them. So let's go ahead and do that now, while we are doing this fight with Rosie. These 5 chickens have a lot in common since they're all rewards for fully completing everything about every other Vivosaur. They all have the same exact stats, being 200 life points, 30 attack, 10 defense, 48 accuracy, 30 evasion, and a 20% critical chance. They also are all long-range Vivosaurs, and they have a golden counter skill, as well as the Parting Blow passive ability. Now, moving over to talk about them individually, each of the chickens have a different type. So the neutral type chicken is Squick. I've already talked about how these Vivosaurs are incredibly weak, so I won't go beating a dead horse, or I guess in this case, a dead chicken. But Squick has access to a Silver Scare skill with a 40% chance of successfully inflicting the opponent, but the big thing about these chickens are their support effects. Squick is actually special in that case, being the only one of them to have negative support effects for your opponent, rather than having positive support effects for your side. Next up is the Fire Chicken Squirk. Squirk has access to a Silver Excite skill with a 50% chance of inflicting the opponent. Now, something you will notice going over the next 4 of the chickens, besides Squick, which we just went over, they all have positive support effects for your side, but more specifically, they have one 50% boost, one 30% boost, one 20% boost, and one 10% boost. But each of the chickens boosts the different stats differently, and each of them have their best stat, the 50% boost, in a different stat. In the case of Squirk, it is the attack-centered chicken, so it has its 50% boost being an attack. Next up is the Earth Chicken Squirth. Squirth has a Golden Sleep skill that has a 60% chance of inflicting the target. Squirth is also the defensive chicken out of the bunch, having its highest support effect being a 50% boost in defense. After Squirth is the Water Chicken Squilk. Squilk comes equipped with a Silver Poison skill that it can use with an 80% chance of inflicting the target and will cause 15% of the target's life points and damage. Squilk is the accuracy chicken out of the 5 chickens, having its highest support effect being the 50% boost in accuracy. Squilk is also my choice for the weakest of the chickens, since its support effects have the lowest combination of attack and defense, and boosts accuracy, which is usually the least useful skill to raise. And the last of the chickens is the air-type chicken, Squirro. Squirro actually has an interesting combination of skills and support effect distribution. Squirro is the evasion chicken, with its 50% boost being in the evasion stat, This can be used with its skill that has a 90% chance of causing the target to be confused, since confused Vivosaurs randomly attack or switch, and if they attack a Vivosaur with really high boosted evasion, there's a high chance that they will miss and waste their FP. Skryro is my personal choice for the best of the chickens, since it has my favorite support effect distribution, and it actually has skills that complement those support effects as well.